Sometimes by learning more about other faiths, as we do in Avodah Zarah, particularly about idolatrous faiths, but not only, we can learn a whole lot more about some of the unique qualities of our own, of the Torah. And one area where the way we live our Torah is so unique is in the relationship between ideas and objects, between the spiritual and the physical, the material and the spiritual, and between the ideas that we have in Kabbalah, and something that the Tel Zerov in Shir Das works on a lot is the idea of Chomer and tzura, the difference between the material from which things are made, and tzura is the design. The design is the object, is the idea. So the chomer of a computer is plastic and copper and silicon. The tzura is the circuitry which makes it work. And how we relate, how chomer and tzura relate to one another, will help us understand an interesting element in the sugya. Part of the piece of Gemara, this is ideas and objects, chomer v'tzura, avodas kechovim שנשתברה מאיליה. What happens if an idol breaks up into pieces all on its own? Avodah Zarah Daf Mem Aleph Amud Beis. It's based on a piece of Tanakh in Shmuel, where the Plishtim conquered the Aron. There was a terrible period in our history where the Plishtim from Gaza were successful, and they captured, and at that time they didn't take people as hostages, although they did that as well, but they were smart. They took the Aron. They managed to get the Aron, the Ark of Hashem, with the luchos inside, and they took it as hostage from Bnei Yisrael. Vayavi'ehu me'even ha'ezer Ashdoda. They took it to Ashdod. Vayichu plishtim et Aron ha'elekim vayavi'u oto Beit Dagon. And then they took the Aron and took it to the temple of Dagon. Dagon was an idol that they used to worship that had the form of a fish from the waist down and of a human being from the waist up, like a male mermaid. Vayatzigu oto etzel Dagon, and they put the Oren in front of Dagon. Imagine what a terrible humiliation that was, and what it felt like for the Jewish people. We have a sense of what it's like to have our precious assets, our precious human beings in the hands of the Plishtim of today, to have the Oren not only captured and in their hands, but put into the Beit Dagon, into the house of idolatry there. The next day, the Ashdodim, the people of Ashdod, came to temple, and they saw their big idol had fallen over. Lifnei Aron Hashem, in front of the Aron of Hashem. So no big deal. They put him back in his position. It didn't strike them as odd that this big, massive idol had never fallen down before. And the moment they put the Aron Hashem there, it falls down in front of the Aron as if it's bowing down to the Aron. But they attribute that to random coincidence. It can happen, it fell over. The next morning they come to temple. Now it has fallen down onto the ground before the Aron Hashem. And the head of Dagon and his two hands are chopped off, krutot ala miftan, chopped off by the lintel in front of the door. So the idol had fallen over. There was obviously a little step where the door was, and that step was sharp enough to crack the Dagon and chop off his head and his arms. This is the next day. He's never fallen down before. Dagon has been stable for years. All of a sudden they bring the Aron in, and Dagon collapses twice. Rak Dagon nishar alav. Al kein lo yidruchu kohanei Dagon v'chol habeim beit Dagon al miftan Dagon ba'Ashdod ad hayom hazeh. So the Ashdod people don't walk on this lintel. Is it called a lintel? What's the bottom piece called? The lintel is the top, actually, isn't it? What's the bottom of the door called? Is it a doorstep? Is that what you would call it? The doorstep. They don't walk on that doorstep till this day. They step over it, they're careful. Once this happened, they don't walk on the doorstep. That's a piece of Tanakh. We use this to explore a machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the two very great friends and chavrusas who saw the world very, very differently. If an idol just cracks by itself, like the case of Dagon, nobody broke it, nobody cracked it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar Muteres. Rabbi Yochanan says the pieces are still idolatrous and we cannot get any benefit from the pieces, even though they're not used anymore. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says once it's cracked, it's mutter. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura lo bitla. Rabbi Yochanan says it's forbidden because nobody undid the idolatrous meaning attributed to it in the first place. So they served it as an idol, as we'll see in the next few daf and elsewhere in the Masechta, that to undo the idolatrous dimension of an idol, you've actually got to be mevatel it. They've got to say this is no longer an idol and break it or do something to it, or at least declare that it is no longer an idol. Rabbi Yochanan says, nobody did anything. This idol broke, but nobody's done anything about removing the idolatrous meaning from the pieces. This word mistama is very interesting. We can assume that they have been mevatel, they've nullified it. Meimer Omer, surely somebody would say, this idol didn't have the strength to stand up. It couldn't stand against the forces of random coincidence. Is it going to save my life? You can see that the idol has been weakened, and clearly, therefore, they were mevatel. Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, I don't understand then how you learn this piece of Tanakh. So they're now fragments of the idol lying on the doorstep, and they don't walk on the doorstep anymore. So you see, even though it's fragments, they still honor the fragments. It's still got Avodah Zarah powers. Reish Lakish says, you bring me a proof from there. There they've stopped serving Dagon. It's not that they don't walk on the doorstep because of the fragments of Dagon that are on the doorstep. That's not what it is. But the Amri Hachi Shavke Israel Dagon Va'ata Eitiv Le'alam Biftan. The force of holiness that used to be embedded in Dagon has left Dagon and now moved on to the doorstep, because the doorstep killed Dagon. So clearly the doorstep now has the sanctity, not the Dagon itself anymore. So you can't bring a proof from there. You want to prove that they're still worshipping the fragments. No, they're not worshipping the fragments, they're worshipping the doorstep. The fragments are irrelevant. This Gemara comes in Meilya as well. And interestingly, in Meilya, these words aren't there. Where it says, Mistama bitule mevatila, that's not there in the version in Meilya. In the version in Meilya, it just says, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Omar Muteret, Meimer Omar Iyanav Shelo Atzla Lahai Gavra Matzala. That mistama, we can assume those words aren't there, and that's quite relevant. And Rashi in Meilya is important as well. Rashi says, "De lo bitla sharei lo bitla oved kechovim beferush." The problem, says Rabbi Yochanan, is that he didn't actually enunciate the words saying, "This idol no longer has any meaning to us." Reish Lakish says that you don't need that. De bitla oved kechovim belibo. He doesn't have to articulate it. It's enough if he thinks in his mind that this idol has lost its power. It couldn't take care of itself, so it can't take care of anybody else. That thought is enough to undo the so to say holiness of the idol, and therefore it's mutter. That's how Rashi in Meilya understands the machlokes. The machlokes, according to Rashi, is: do you need somebody to articulate the bitul? Like we say when we mevatel chometz on Pesach, yeah, you can, even if you do it in your heart, the bitul works. But we say it out loud. Says Rabbi Yochanan, when it comes to the laws of Avodah Zarah, it has to be said out loud. Whereas Rabbi Reish Lakish says it does not have to be said out loud. And we see that Rabbi Chananel on our Gemara goes in the same route. Reish Lakish Omar Muter Kivan Shenishtabra Omar Beda'ate. Says Reish Lakish says, as long as he says in his mind, that's sufficient. So that's how Rashi understands the Gemara. The difficulty with Rashi, there are two difficulties with this understanding of the Gemara, the way we've just understood it. So again, the argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is about whether you have to articulate the nullification, or you can just think this is no meaning, this is null and void, and think that in your mind. The one difficulty is asked by the Ravid. Now the Ravid is a perush on the Avodah Zarah by the Ravid, the same Ravid that we have on the Rambam, and this perush only got published in 1961. There was a wonderful scholar, Rabbi Avram Sofer, I think he's a descendant of the Chassam Sofer, who was responsible for most of the Me'iris that we've got. He found the manuscripts of the Me'iri and he corrected them and published them and put notes on them. He did wonderful work. And later on in his life, he found this Raavad on Avodah Zarah. And he published it first in 1961, and then again it was published more recently. And we have it quoted by Rishonim. So some of the Rishonim obviously knew these Raavads, the Raavads on Avodah Zarah, and some maybe didn't. Rav Sofer himself says he believes the Ritvo did not see this, that it was only quoted secondhand. And you'll see why I think this is relevant. The Raavad asks the question based on the Gemara on the next daf. He has a question of the Gemara on the next daf. He says, if we learn it the way we've just learned it, then it must be kegon de ashkecha b'makom sheharabim mitzuyim sham de'ivshar shelo ra'a ota goy. It must be a place where non-Jews are walking past it, so that somebody must have looked at it and was mevatel. Somebody nullified it. Aval b'makom de'ike lemecha shema lo ra'a ota goy mishenishtabra. But if this got broken in a place where maybe no goyim had walked past, it's in an isolated place and no people are walking past, now we can't make that assumption that a non-Jew saw it and either nullified it in his mind, Reish Lakish says would be okay, or he nullified it verbally, as Rabbi Yochanan says he would have to. But if there are no people there at all, there's no nullification at all. And based on that, he asks a question on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph, on tomorrow's Daf. And then he answers, you've got to say, therefore, says the Raavad, that when the idol breaks, it is automatically nullified. You don't need a human being. It happens automatically. That's the only way that you can understand this machlokes in the Gemara and Daf Mem Beis. And it's interesting, I've seen this Raavad quoted, the first part quoted, but not the Maskana, and his conclusion is what's really important. So the Raavad, it seems to be learning differently from Rashi. That the machlokes here, we're talking about a situation where it automatically is bottle. So what difference does it mean now? What's the machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? What are they arguing about? So we'll see in a moment. There's a second difficulty with the way we learn it according to Rashi. And that difficulty is asked by Reb Shlomo Kluger. Reb Shlomo Kluger, early 19th century, wrote a sefer on Avodah Zarah called Avodas Avodah. And he asks the question here, also a brilliant question. He says, how can you ask from this case in Shmuel, case in Tanakh with Dagon? He says, clearly Rabbi Shimon is saying we can assume that a non-Jew nullified it. But if you know that they didn't nullify it, if you see them still serving the fragments, even Reish Lakish would agree that this is not nullified. And the case of Dagon, you see they're still serving the fragments. So you can't learn from Dagon to a general statement. Since Reish Lakish's general principle is based on an assumption, mistoma, you can assume that some non-Jew was mevatel it, and here you know that assumption is false because you see they're serving it. So it's irrelevant. You can't bring a proof from the parasha in Shmuel. And he says at the end, he brings proofs from Yehush that's how it works, that there are assumptions to be made unless you know for sure that the facts are different. And in the case of Dagon, you know for sure the facts are different. They're worshipping the pieces. So the machlokes of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan doesn't even come into it because you know they're worshipping the pieces. That's if you're learning like Reish Lakish, where you need somebody to be mevatel it. But if you learn like the Raavad, it's a little bit different. What is the Raavad? How do I understand the Raavad? I understand the Raavad that the machlokes is different. The machlokes is idolatry about the concept or the object. About an idol, the person's bowing down to a tree, the person's bowing down to a symbol, the person's bowing down to the Dagon. Is he bowing down? Does he find sanctity in the matter of the object? Is that where their holiness lies? Or is it in the symbol that it represents? As some of the Rishonim say, this Dagon represents Mazal Dagim, it represents the constellation of Pisces. And that's what they worship. So they're worshipping a constellation, they're not worshipping the object. The difference would be if the object shatters. If the object shatters, the pieces are still there, but the concept has been it's no longer a fish. It doesn't look like a fish anymore. It looks like pieces of pottery. It doesn't have its design. It doesn't have its form. Are they worshipping the design, the idea behind the object, or are they worshipping the object itself? That's the machlokes Rabbi Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says they're worshipping the object itself. And therefore, when the object breaks, it doesn't matter. The material is still there. Each little piece is still holy for them. It doesn't lose its holiness because it's broken. Whereas Reish Lakish says, no, they're worshipping the idea behind the object. They're worshipping the concept of the fish. And once it's no longer recognizable as a fish, it means nothing anymore. It has no meaning anymore. That's their machlokes. And therefore, the Ravid, and you see that even in the words of the Ravid, if you look at the second paragraph of the Ravid, Ki hayovdim lemazal dagim, says the Ravid. They're not serving this thing, this piece of porcelain called dagon. Vayu mitzayrim et tzuratam kidmut dag v'tzurat dag v'ovdim et hatzura. And they served the design, they didn't serve the object. That's what's important there. And therefore, when the object breaks and it loses its design, it's like, again, the computer breaks. It falls on the floor and it shatters into a million pieces. It's no longer a computer. Dagon breaks and it falls into a million pieces. It's no longer Dagon. You don't take the pieces and serve them. It's lost its design. It's lost its idea. It's lost its ideology. It's just a thing. It's just an object. And what's interesting to me is that if we understand it this way, the machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish assumes it's one or the other. Do they serve the matter, the material of the idol, or do they deserve the concept, the ideology of the idol? Is that what they serve? That's the machlokes. It's one or the other. Because in other faiths, there's a bifurcation between the spirituality and the physical. It's one or the other. Is idolatry attaching spirituality to an object? Or is idolatry serving spirituality represented by an object? It's a fundamentally different view of what idolatry is. And what about in Torah? And Daf Yud Ches, we had back there, you remember the story of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, and when he's being burnt with the Sefer Torah around him, and his Talmidim say, Ma ata ro'eh, what do you see? What did he answer? Omar lahem gilayon nisrafin ve'otiyot porchot. I see the parchment is being burnt and the words are flying back to Shamayim. The tzura, the design, the meaning, the ideology, that's not being burnt. They can't destroy that. They can destroy the parchment. What's the difference with the parchment? But we know that the parchment also has kedusha, how you have to treat a Sefer Torah. So the way it works in our Torah is when spirituality is attached to an object, the object transforms. If you remove the spirituality from the object is just an object. It doesn't mean anything. As long as there are words written on the Sefer Torah and they've been written b'kedusha by a Sefer, it's not just the words that have kedusha. The object has kedusha as well, and we treat it with enormous respect and honor. But if those words disappear, the object no longer has that spirituality. Just as matter can change if you apply energy to it. Its form changes. It can change from a solid to a liquid, from a liquid to a gas. So when you apply spirituality to an object, the object changes. It's not the same object. So once the letters had left the Sefer Torah, the parchment was just parchment. It wasn't anything. But as long as the letters were in the Sefer Torah, the parchment itself was elevated to a level of Kedusha. And Pigid Rabbi Eliezer says in Perik Mem Hey that when the letters of the Luchos saw Bnei Yisrael dancing around the Egel, they flew into the sky. And that's why the tablets became too heavy to hold. Because as long as there was meaning in them and the words were on the Luchos, Moshe could hold them because the physical is elevated by the spiritual that is embedded in it. But if you separate the spiritual, if you take the spiritual out of the physical, what you're left with is nothing but physical. And we need to understand that in our lives, in everything that we do, that when we infuse spirituality, it's not just the spiritual that goes. Our tefillin, the physical tefillin, have kedusha to them. Our shul, the shul itself, the bricks of the shul, the wood of the benches, everything in the shul, there's kedusha in all of them because the kedusha is attached. If you take the kedusha out of it, there's nothing. And so it is in every area of our lives. If we take the sanctity out of our lives, what we're left with is heavy, meaningless, material, nothing. It's just stuff. It's just things. When we infuse Kedusha, when we give meaning and purpose to things and to our own lives, and we elevate them, to serve Hashem, to do that which is right with them. It's not just that we have the object and we have meaning and we have purpose in our lives. No, the purpose of our lives is infused into the very object and elevates the object from being a normal physical object to being a chefza shel kedusha, to being an object of sanctity, and its physical properties, so to say, change. Like the luchos became lighter, the actual physical properties somewhat change. So in the case of idolatry and other faiths, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are examining, do they serve the idea or do they serve the object? In Torah, that's not a question. You serve the idea and the object when they're infused in as one. That's the achdus, that's the oneness of avodas Hashem. When Hashem and the world is one, is bound together, there's kedusha in the world, the whole world gets uplifted. If we separate them out, we put the kedusha in one place and the world or the object in another place, not only is there no kedusha, but the object itself degenerates and becomes nothing but a physical object with the full weight and burden of physicality.